Out on the Wyoming prairie in 1884, the wind doesn't just whisper, it screams. It's a lonely sound, the kind that scrapes the soul clean, leaving you with nothing but the grit of your own thoughts. For Thomas Becket, a man barely 20 years old, but with the eyes of someone twice his age, that sound was the only real company he had. His ranch was a tiny speck of defiance against a landscape that wanted nothing more than to swallow it whole. 50 miles of nothing separated him from the nearest town, a place called Redemption that hadn't seen much of it. 2 years ago, his father had chased a dream right into a flash flood, leaving Thomas with a pile of debt, a few bony cattle, and a silence so heavy you could feel it pressing on your chest. His days were a blur of mending fences that the wind just laughed at, hauling water from a well that seemed to be getting deeper every day, and chopping wood until his hands were raw. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was the quiet that was the real killer. The quiet after the sun bled out across the horizon, leaving him alone under a blanket of cold, indifferent stars. He was a ghost on his own land, a solitary figure in an endless sea of brown and gray. And then one afternoon, with the sky spitting a miserable cold rain, everything changed. He was riding the northern fence line, the same one he'd fixed a dozen times that season. The work was endless, pointless, a battle he was destined to lose against the sheer will of the wilderness. His horse, Bess, a sturdy mare, with more sense than most people he knew, picked her way along a ridge overlooking a dry creek bed. And that's when he saw it, a patch of dirt that was just wrong. It wasn't a washout from the rain. The earth was mounded, pushed up from below. It was unnatural, and a cold dread, colder than the rain soaking through his coat, began to creep up his spine. He swung off Bess, his boots sinking into the mud. The mound was about the size of a man. It looked like a grave, a fresh one. The dirt was still loose, piled up in a hurry. Who would be buried way out here, alone? His heart started hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Then his eyes snagged on a piece of cloth, caught on a thorny bush near the edge of the mound. It was dark fabric, patterned with faded red and white shapes. It wasn't the kind of cloth a settler would wear. It was tribal. Navajo. He dropped to his knees, the cold mud soaking through his trousers, and he started digging. He didn't have a shovel, just his bare hands, clawing at the cold, wet earth. Fear was a bitter taste in his mouth, but something else was there too. A grim, stubborn refusal to just ride away. To leave this secret buried. His fingers, numb with cold, scraped against something hard. Wood. Not a proper coffin, but rough planks, nailed together in a hurry. He scrabbled at the dirt faster now, his breath coming in ragged white puffs in the cold air. He cleared enough soil to see the top of a crude wooden box. It was just big enough to hold a person. And then he saw the holes, a series of small, rough holes punched through the top plank. They were air holes. He froze, every muscle in his body locking up. The wind howled, and for a second, he thought he was imagining it. A sound, a faint, muffled sound from inside the box. It was a moan, a weak, ragged breath, almost swallowed by the wind. But it was there. His blood turned to ice. It wasn't a grave. It was a cage, and someone was inside. Someone was alive. Adrenaline hit him like a lightning strike, a cold, sharp fire that burned away the fear. He looked around wildly and spotted a length of fence post lying nearby. He grabbed it, the wood heavy and solid in his hands, and jammed it under the edge of the top plank. He put all his weight into it, his muscles screaming in protest. The wood groaned. The nails shrieked as they were pulled from their hold. He worked like a man possessed, the rain plastering his hair to his face, his knuckles bloody and raw. With a final splintering crack, the lid came free. He dropped the post and fell to his knees, peering into the darkness of the shallow box. And what he saw would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Curled on her side, wrapped in layers of damp, dark cloth, was a woman. Her face was pale as bone, her dark hair matted with dirt and blood. She was small, impossibly frail, and she was, without a doubt, Navajo. Her eyes were closed, her face turned toward the air holes he'd seen. She looked so young, maybe 18, maybe younger. Relief so powerful it made him dizzy, washed over him, but it was followed immediately by a tidal wave of dread. Why was she here? Who could do something like this? Bury a person alive? The questions swirled in his mind, each one darker than the last. He reached a trembling hand into the box and gently touched her shoulder. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. They were dark, wide pools of terror and confusion. She stared up at him, a wild-looking stranger framed against a bleak gray sky, and a tiny broken sound escaped her lips. She didn't speak. She couldn't. She just looked at him, her breath coming in shallow, shuddering gasps. You're alive, he stammered, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the oppressive quiet. He had to get her out of there. He moved slowly, deliberately, trying not to frighten her more than she already was. He helped her sit up, his arm supporting her back. She was shivering violently, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook her whole body. He didn't know if it was from the cold or from the sheer terror of what she'd endured. He shrugged off his own worn coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was a small gesture against the biting wind, but it was all he had to give. Getting her out of the box was an awkward, painful process. Her limbs were stiff, and every movement seemed to cause her pain. He lifted her as gently as he could, her body feeling as light as a child's in his arms, and set her on the muddy ground. Her legs immediately gave out, and she collapsed, a small, huddled shape in his oversized coat. He knelt beside her, a storm of thoughts raging in his head. He couldn't leave her here, but taking her with him, that was a different kind of danger altogether. A young Navajo woman buried alive on his land. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was deliberate. This was an execution. Was it her own people? Had she broken some sacred law? Or was it outsiders? White men who saw her as less than human. The thought made his stomach clench into a tight, hard knot. Bringing her to his cabin meant inviting trouble to his doorstep. It meant questions he couldn't answer, and judgments from a world he'd spent his whole life avoiding. The folks in Redemption weren't known for their open minds, but leaving her here to die? That was impossible. The prairie was a harsh teacher, but it taught you one thing above all. You don't leave a soul to the wolves, human or otherwise. My place, it isn't far, he said, his voice rough. Can you walk? She just stared at him, her dark eyes trying to read his face, his intentions. He realized with a sinking feeling that she didn't understand a word of English. He gestured towards Bess, then pointed in the direction of his ranch, hidden somewhere in the rolling hills. He stood up slowly and offered her his hand. For a long moment, she just looked at it. Then hesitantly, she reached out, and her small, cold fingers closed around his. He helped her to her feet, and she swayed, gripping his arm to keep from falling. Getting her onto the horse was another challenge. She was so weak. He had to lift her almost the whole way, settling her side saddle in front of him, her back resting against his chest. She felt as fragile as a bird. He mounted behind her, gathering the reins, feeling the constant, violent shivering of her body against his. The ride back to his cabin was silent. The only sounds were the mournful howl of the wind, the soft squelch of Bess's hooves in the mud, and the woman's shallow, ragged breathing. He held her loosely, overwhelmed by her vulnerability, by the sheer, impossible reality of the situation. He thought of his mother, gone 7 years now, and the simple, unwavering decency she had taught him. What would she have done? He knew the answer. He was doing it. His small, lonely cabin came into view, a plume of smoke rising from the chimney. It had never looked so welcoming. He dismounted first, then carefully helped her down. She stumbled and he caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist in a brief, awkward embrace. He guided her to the door and pushed it open. The warmth from the fire washed over them, thick with the smell of wood smoke and old coffee. He led her to the single wooden chair by the hearth, and she sank into it, pulling his coat tighter around herself as if it were a shield. He threw more wood on the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. In the flickering firelight, he could see her more clearly. There was a dark, ugly bruise spreading across her temple. Her hands were covered in deep cuts, raw and bloody. Her clothes were torn, caked with mud. He knelt by the fire, feeling a fresh wave of panic. What was he supposed to do now? He knew how to fix a fence, how to birth a calf, how to survive a blizzard. He knew nothing about caring for a person, especially a person who was this hurt, this terrified. He felt a profound sense of responsibility settle over him, heavy as a shroud. He rummaged through a cupboard and found a relatively clean cloth. He poured some warm water from the kettle into a basin and approached her carefully, like she was a spooked foal. She watched his every move, her eyes wide and wary. He used simple gestures, pointing to the bruise on her head, then to the water in the cloth. I, I want to help, he said, the words feeling inadequate. He knew she couldn't understand them, but he hoped she could understand his tone, his intent. She flinched when his hand came near her face, but she didn't pull away. He gently dabbed at her temple, cleaning away the dirt and dried blood. Her skin was ice cold to the touch. He worked slowly, his hands, usually so calloused and clumsy, moving with a strange gentleness. He cleaned the cuts on her hands next. They were deep, angry wounds, as if she'd been clawing desperately at the inside of that wooden box. When he was done, he tore strips from an old shirt and loosely bandaged her hands. He wiped the remaining dirt from her face, revealing the sharp, delicate lines of her cheekbones, the proud curve of her jaw. She was beautiful, even beneath the pain and the fear. He heated some broth, the only thing he had that seemed remotely suitable, and brought it to her in a tin cup. She looked at the cup, then up at him, questioning. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. Her bandaged hands trembled as she took it, and she sipped the warm liquid slowly. A little bit of life seemed to flicker back into her eyes. The silence in the cabin stretched on, thick and heavy with everything that was unsaid, everything that was unknown. He sat across from her, just watching. He noticed the intricate beadwork on the collar of her tunic, the simple silver bracelets on her wrists. They spoke of a life, a culture, a world he couldn't begin to imagine. What kind of monster would do this? What kind of hatred? What kind of cruelty leads to burying a young woman alive? The thought sent another chill down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the cold outside. He had only one bedroll. He laid it out for her near the fire, in the warmest part of the small cabin. He gestured for her to lie down. She hesitated, her eyes searching his face one last time. Then she slowly, stiffly, eased herself onto the roll. He covered her with his only blanket, tucking it around her shoulders. She closed her eyes, and her breathing, though still shallow, seemed to come a little easier. He sank into the chair, the weight of the day, of the discovery, crashing down on him. He stared into the flames, listening to the wind rage outside and the soft, fragile sound of her breath inside. He had no idea what the morning would bring. He had no idea if he'd just saved a life or signed his own death warrant. But as he sat there, in the quiet dark of his lonely cabin, he knew one thing for sure. She was safe. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. The woman, he still didn't know her name, was in a bad way. She was weak, dehydrated, and haunted by a trauma he couldn't even begin to comprehend. She slept a lot, a restless, troubled sleep filled with soft moans and sudden, jerking movements. When she was awake, she was mostly silent, her dark eyes following him as he moved about the small cabin. He tended to her wounds, shared his meager food, and slowly, painstakingly, began to learn the language of her expressions. A slight furrow of her brow meant pain. A quick glance towards the water bucket meant thirst. It was during one of these quiet moments, as he was changing the dressing on her wrist, that he saw it. Hidden beneath the cloth and the dried blood was a mark. It wasn't a scratch or a scar from her struggle. It was a brand. The skin was puckered and dark, seared into a strange, angular symbol. It looked like a stylized bird, or maybe a serpent, coiled in on itself. It wasn't any tribal marking he'd ever seen or heard of. It looked almost official, like the brands they used on cattle. But this was precise, intricate, a sickening feeling coiled in his stomach. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a tribal punishment. This was something else, something cold, calculated, and organized. Who marks a person like a piece of property before burying them alive? The question echoed in the silent cabin, and he had no answers. He tried to ask her about it, pointing to the mark on her wrist, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. But the moment she saw what he was looking at, a wall of pure terror slammed down behind her eyes. She pulled her hand away, cradling it to her chest, and turned her face to the wall, a single silent tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. He didn't push it. He knew then that the brand was connected to the darkest part of her story, a part she wasn't ready or able to share. One morning he woke to find her sitting up by the cold hearth, her eyes wide. She looked at him, then down at the ashes. With a trembling finger she began to draw. It was the same symbol from her wrist. She drew it over and over again, her movements frantic, obsessive. Then beside the symbols she drew a figure. A man. His face was crude, just a circle with two dots for eyes, but one feature was drawn with chilling detail. A long, jagged line that cut down from his eyebrow to his jaw. A scar. He knelt beside her, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty by some nameless monster. This was a message. She was telling him something. She was telling him who. She tapped the drawing of the scarred man. Then she made a gesture like she was holding a rifle. Then she pointed to herself and made a digging motion. The story was becoming clearer, and with every detail, it grew more terrifying. A man with a scar, associated with this strange symbol, had ordered her to be buried. But why? A few days later, the answer came riding over the horizon. He was outside chopping wood when he heard the sound of hooves, too many for a lone rider. He straightened up, his hand resting on the axe handle, and watched as three men approached his cabin. He recognized them instantly. They were from Redemption. And the man in the lead was Bartholomew Price, a local rancher with a mean streak as wide as the prairie and a deep-seated hatred for anyone who wasn't exactly like him. Thomas's gut clenched. He'd known this day would come. He stood his ground as they rode up, his posture a clear warning. "Beckett," Price spat, his eyes scanning the small cabin with open contempt. "Heard you've taken in some company." His gaze flickered to the cabin door, where the woman now stood, a silent shadow in the doorway. Thomas saw a strange look flash across Price's face. It wasn't just curiosity or racist disdain. It was something else. It was recognition, and it was fear. "Heard you've been harboring a stray," Price continued, his voice dripping with venom. "An Injun stray at that." "She was hurt," Thomas said, his voice low and steady, his knuckles white on the axe handle. "I'm helping her." "Helping her?" one of Price's men sneered. "Or helping yourself? We know her kind. They bring nothing but trouble." Price's eyes were locked on the woman. He didn't seem to be looking at her so much as for something. His gaze drifted down to her hands, which she held clasped in front of her. "Her own people cast her out, I hear," Price said, his voice a low growl. "Must have been for a good reason. We don't need their troubles spilling onto our land." Thomas took a step forward, placing himself squarely between them and the door. The protective instinct that rose in him was fierce, primal. "She's under my roof. That makes her my business. You've got no business here." Price dismounted, his movements slow and menacing. He was a big man, used to getting his way through intimidation. "The safety of this territory is my business, Beckett. And that thing in your cabin is a threat." He took another step, and that's when Thomas saw it. A faint white scar that ran along Price's jawline, partially hidden by his beard. It wasn't the same deep, jagged scar from the drawing, but it was a scar nonetheless. And in that moment, 100 dark possibilities clicked into place. Price wasn't here just because he was a bigot. He was here because he was connected. He knew something. He was afraid of what she might say. "Get off my land, Price," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but carrying a weight of deadly seriousness. He raised the axe slightly, the polished steel glinting in the cold sunlight. Price hesitated. He looked from the axe to Thomas's face, a face that was no longer that of a boy, but of a man pushed to his limit. He looked past him to the woman in the doorway, who met his gaze without flinching. Price let out a harsh, ugly laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're making a big mistake, boy," he snarled. He swung himself back onto his horse. "A big mistake. This ain't over." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men following close behind. Thomas stood there for a long time, the axe still in his hand, his heart pounding. He watched them until they were just specks on the horizon. The confrontation was over, but the war had just begun. He turned and walked back into the cabin. The woman was still standing there, her face pale, but her eyes were filled with a new light. He knew, and she knew that he knew. They weren't just a man and a woman anymore. They were allies, and they were in more danger than he had ever imagined. The confrontation with Price changed everything. The unspoken threat was now out in the open, a tangible thing that hung in the air between them. The isolation of the ranch no longer felt like a prison of loneliness. It felt like a fortress under siege. The woman who he finally learned was named Nahili began to open up. The shared danger had forged a bond between them, a trust that transcended language. She started to teach him, not just words but a way of seeing the world. She taught him the names of the prairie plants, which ones could heal and which could harm. She showed him how to read the clouds, to predict the weather with an accuracy that startled him. In return, he taught her English. The words came slowly at first, soft and hesitant on her tongue, but her mind was quick. Fire, water, horse, sky. Each new word was a brick in the bridge they were building between their two worlds. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, trapping them in the warm cocoon of the cabin, she finally told him. Not everything, but enough. She used her growing English, her expressive hands, in the ashes of the fire to paint a picture of what had happened. She hadn't been cast out for breaking some tribal law. She had been silenced. She had been tending her family's sheep near the edge of the reservation when she saw them, a group of men, some from her own tribe, elders he recognized, and some white men. One of them was the man with the deep scar across his face. Another was Price. They were making a deal. The white men were giving the elders rifles and whiskey. In exchange, the elders were showing them something on a map, a place where yellow rock could be found. Gold. It was a secret, forbidden deal. Her people's law was absolute. The sacred lands and their secrets were not to be sold. Nahili had been seen. The scarred man had pointed at her, and the tribal elders, their faces a mask of fear and greed, had looked away. They couldn't risk the white men killing her and bringing the soldiers down on them, but they couldn't let her speak either. So they chose a third option, a solution that was both a betrayal and, in their twisted logic, a form of protection. They would return her to the earth. They performed a hasty, shame-filled ceremony and buried her. Not to kill her, she explained, but to imprison her until the white men were gone. The air holes, the lack of a proper burial rite, it was a sign that they intended for her to be found later. But something had gone wrong. The men led by Price had stayed in the area longer than expected. Her people were too afraid to come back for her. They had left her to die. The story settled in the small cabin, a tale of greed and betrayal so profound, it left Thomas breathless. Price wasn't just a bully. He was a conspirator, an accessory to a crime that was both a theft and an attempted murder. He was terrified of Nahili not because of what she was, but because of what she knew. She was the only living witness to a deal that could get them all hanged. Thomas looked at her, at this small, resilient woman who had survived being betrayed by everyone she had ever trusted, and a feeling he couldn't quite name swelled in his chest. It was more than admiration. It was more than responsibility. It was a fierce, protective love. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, and in that simple touch, a promise was made. He would not betray her. He would not abandon her. They were in this together until the very end. As winter tightened its grip on the prairie, the ranch became their world. The snow fell in thick, silent blankets, cutting them off completely. The danger from Price and his men felt distant, a problem for a future season. For now there was only the cabin, the fire, and each other. The forced proximity, which could have been a prison, instead became a sanctuary. They fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. He would brave the elements to care for the cattle and mend what he could, while she transformed the stark cabin into a home. She used the beads she'd had with her and sinew he provided to create intricate patterns on his worn leather gloves, bringing color and life into the drab space. They talked for hours. He told her about his father's impossible dreams, his mother's quiet strength, and the crushing loneliness that had been his only companion for 2 long years. She told him about her family, her people's stories of the creation of the world, of the coyote and the stars. She spoke of a life so different from his, yet filled with the same love and loss. The more they shared, the more the chasm between their two worlds disappeared. He stopped seeing a Navajo woman. He just saw Nahili, and in his eyes she no longer saw a white stranger, but the man who had dug her out of the earth with his bare hands. The man who had chosen kindness when the world had offered only cruelty. One afternoon, Thomas was struggling to repair a broken piece of his saddle, his fingers clumsy and stiff from the cold. He cursed under his breath, ready to throw the thing into the fire. Nahili came over, a small smile playing on her lips. She took the leather and the awl from his hands. Her fingers, so small and delicate, moved with a speed and precision that mesmerized him. She stitched the leather together with a seamless, perfect knot he'd never seen before. It was a small thing, but it was everything. They were a team. He was strong where she was weak, and she was skilled where he was clumsy. Together, they were whole. As the blizzard howled its fury outside, the warmth inside the cabin was about more than just the fire. He looked at her, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked on her beadwork. She looked up and met his gaze. The world seemed to fall away. There was no blizzard, no price, no danger. There was only the two of them. In that moment, he knew he was lost. He had fallen in love with this impossible woman, this survivor. "Thomas," she said, her voice a soft murmur that was almost lost in the sound of the wind. "Thank you." "For what?" he asked, his own voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "For seeing me," she said, her English still careful, deliberate. "My own people." They looked away. The white men, they saw a thing, an obstacle. You saw a person. "Anyone would have done the same," he said, though he knew it wasn't true. She shook her head, her dark eyes serious. "No, not anyone. You have a good heart, Thomas Beckett, a strong heart." She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "Here," she whispered, "strong." His own hand came up to cover hers and he leaned in. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then deeper, a silent confession of everything they had become to each other. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and sorrow, and a hope that was as fierce and fragile as a wildflower blooming in the snow. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, two lonely souls had finally found their shelter. They had found their home. The spring thaw came slowly, turning the world to a sea of mud and slush. With the melting snow came a renewed sense of urgency. Their supplies were dangerously low. The confrontation they had been putting off all winter was now unavoidable. They had to go to redemption. The thought of it settled like a cold stone in Thomas's stomach. To walk into that town with Nahili at his side was to light a fuse on a powder keg. "I should stay," Nahili said one morning, her voice quiet. "Hide. If they see you alone, maybe they will leave you be." Thomas looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and shook his head. "No," he said, his voice firm. "We've been hiding long enough. We face them together." It was a declaration, a commitment. They were no longer just a man and a woman hiding from the world. They were a united front. They would ride into that town and face the hatred head on, side by side. The day they rode into redemption was bright and clear, but the air was thick with tension. Thomas rode Bess, and Nahili rode a small, sturdy pony he'd managed to trade for. She wore a simple dress, but she had braided bright, defiant ribbons into her dark hair, and her silver bracelets shone in the sun. She sat tall in the saddle, her chin held high. She looked like a queen. As they rode down the town's single, dusty main street, a hush fell over everything. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The silence was more damning than any insult. Thomas could feel the weight of their stares, the cold judgment, the open hostility. He saw Bartholomew Price standing on the porch of the general store, his arms crossed over his massive chest, a venomous smirk on his face. He was waiting for them. They dismounted in front of the store. Thomas helped Nahili down, his hand resting on her arm for a moment longer than necessary, a small gesture of reassurance. He could feel her trembling slightly, but when she looked up, her face was a mask of calm resolve. "Need supplies, Miller," Thomas said, his voice loud in the unnatural quiet. He was addressing the store owner, a nervous, balding man named Joseph Miller, who was wringing his hands in his apron. Miller swallowed hard, his eyes darting from Thomas to Nahili and then to Price. "Now, Beckett," he stammered, I don't want any trouble." Price stepped forward, his boots thudding on the wooden porch. "See, Beckett? I told you, this town doesn't want your kind of trouble. It ain't right, bringing a filthy heathen like that into a decent place." "She's a person, Price," Thomas said, his voice dangerously calm, "and she deserves more decency than you've ever known." "She's an omen!" a woman shouted from the small crowd that had gathered. "She'll bring a curse on this town." And then Nahili did something that stunned them all into silence. She stepped forward, away from the protective shadow of Thomas. She looked at the hostile faces, one by one, her gaze unflinching. And then she spoke. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the dusty street. "I did not bring trouble," she said, her English still accented but perfectly clear. "Trouble found me." She pointed a finger, not at the crowd, but back towards the wilderness they had just ridden from. "I was buried in the dirt, left to die." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The raw, brutal honesty of her words hung in the air. Even Price seemed momentarily taken aback. "Buried?" Miller whispered, his eyes wide. "Yes," Nahili said, her gaze sweeping over them. "Betrayed by some of my own people. Because of a secret that involves gold and lies, and men who are not as decent as they pretend." Her eyes finally landed on Price, and she didn't look away. "This man," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "he was there. He watched them make the deal. He knows the man with the scar on his face. He is afraid of me because I am the only one left who can tell the truth." The crowd erupted into a flurry of murmurs. They turned as one, their gazes shifting from Nahili to Price. The big man's face had gone pale, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "She's lying!" he roared, his voice a little too loud, a little too desperate. "It's a trick, an Injun witch's tale to turn you all against me." "Maybe so, Price," Thomas said, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with Nahili. "Or maybe it's the truth, a truth you've been trying to bury since last autumn." Price sputtered, his eyes wild with panic. He was losing control. The narrative he had so carefully crafted of himself as the town's protector and Nahili as the dangerous outsider was crumbling before his very eyes. And then, the final blow came from the most unexpected of places. The nervous little store owner, Joseph Miller, cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him. "My boy, he was out hunting that week," Miller said, his voice trembling but clear. "He saw you, Price. He saw you riding back from the direction of the reservation, alone. He said you looked haunted, like you'd seen a ghost." The dam broke. The quiet suspicion that had been festering in the town for months, the whispers about Price's sudden wealth, his secretive trips, it all coalesced into a single damning truth. He was a liar. He was a criminal. The town's timid sheriff, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, finally seemed to realize he had no choice. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Price," he said, his voice heavy, "I think you and I need to have a talk." Price looked around, his eyes darting from the sheriff to the angry faces of the townspeople, to Thomas and Nahili, who stood together, unmovable. He was trapped. With a primal roar of fury and terror, he lunged, not at the sheriff, but at Nahili. But Thomas was ready. He moved with a speed born of pure adrenaline, tackling Price around the waist. The two men crashed to the ground in a cloud of dust, fists flying. The fight was brutal but short. Thomas was younger, faster, and fueled by a righteous fury that Price, in his panic, could not match. He subdued the larger man just as the sheriff and two other men from the crowd piled on, pinning Price to the ground. As they hauled a cursing, struggling Bartholomew Price towards the town's small jail, the street was silent once more. But this was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of shock, of revelation, of a world turned upside down. The townspeople looked at Thomas and Nahili, no longer with hatred or suspicion, but with a dawning sense of awe and respect. They had stood up to a tyrant. They had spoken the truth. They had won. Miller, the store owner, finally broke the silence. He wiped his sweaty palms on his apron and gave them a small, shaky smile. "All right, Beckett," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "Come on in. Get what you need. It's on the house." As Thomas and Nahili walked into the store, the crowd parted for them. They had ridden into redemption as outcasts. They would ride out as legends. The journey back to the ranch was quiet, the bags full of supplies a heavy, satisfying weight. The world felt different. The sky seemed brighter, the air cleaner. The vast, empty prairie no longer felt like a place of isolation, but a kingdom, their kingdom. They had faced the worst of the world and had not only survived, but had triumphed. They had found justice. When they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. It looked small, humble, but it was home. Not just a shelter from the storms, but a place where two broken souls had found each other and become whole. Thomas helped Nahili down from her horse. She didn't tremble this time. She stood tall and proud. She looked at him, and in her dark eyes he saw not a hint of the fear that had once consumed her. He saw hope. He saw strength. And he saw a love that was as deep and as endless as the Wyoming sky. They walked towards the cabin together, their hands intertwined, their steps firm on the thawing ground. The wind picked up, but it no longer sounded like a scream. It sounded like a song of survival, a song of a love that had been found in the most unlikely of places, buried in the cold, dark earth, waiting for a good man to bring it into the light. The story of Thomas Beckett and the woman he dug from the earth became a quiet legend in that corner of Wyoming. Price confessed everything, naming the scarred man, a powerful land baron from the east who was eventually brought to justice himself. The gold was never found, but that didn't matter. Thomas and Nahili had found something far more precious. They built a life on that small, struggling ranch, a life filled with hardship and hard work, but also with a quiet joy that was the envy of all who knew them. They faced down prejudice, they defied expectations, and in a world that tried its best to tear them apart, they held on to each other. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are not buried under the ground, but are found in the courage to stand up for what's right and the simple, profound kindness of a stranger's heart. If you were moved by Thomas and Nahili's story of survival and love against all odds, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. And let me know in the comments below. What do you think is the strongest force in the world? Greed or love? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching.